Hey everyone, this is going to be the first part of a series of tutorials for programming with RhinoCAM. To get started, I just wanted to go over how to load RhinoCAM if it's not already loaded, and how you should be laying out your geometry in Rhino and organizing your layers in Rhino. So if you look at the screen here, on the left I have my RhinoCAM window. If that should open automatically when you open Rhino. If for some reason it doesn't and it's not showing there, you should be able to type RhinoCAM 2018 in the command line, hit enter, and that will bring up your window. On the machines you're going to be using, we have already loaded all the tools that you'll need. So the tool library icon is over here, and you can, if you needed to, you can load tool libraries through this button here. This will open up a window, and we will make available to you the tool libraries, so that if you needed to load them for any reason, you'll have those files and you can find them and load them through that location. Another thing, when we post files to our CNC machines, this also should already be done for you when you open up Rhino, but there is a specific post processor that relates to our CNC equipment, and this will already be done on your machine, but we have a CNC Motion. Yours might say CNC Motion AAP, but CNC Motion is the type of machine that we have, and so that will be what you should have selected. Also, the default file extension is NC, but we're going to be using .tap files, so that also should be selected when you open up RhinoCAM by default. But if you needed to, those are the correct settings that you should be using. All right. The next thing we want to look at is the geometry that I have laid out in Rhino here. You can see that there's not a whole lot going on. I just have a rectangle here. This rectangle represents the bed of the CNC machine, and within that rectangle I've laid out the parts that I want to cut. And that's how all of your files should be laid out for any file that you're trying to program to use the CNCs. We often start with a very large model, whether it's a building or a site model, and we're making a lot of changes to that, and ultimately you might have copies of things, and you should get rid of all of that and just export only the geometry that you want to use to CNC. If you have a lot of other geometry in the file, it can clutter things up and cause some really weird issues. The next thing we want to look at is the layer organization here. I've gone through the CNC bed is my first layer, and I have that locked. If I unlock it and select the objects, you can see that that's all that's on that layer is just the curve, and this is a 4 foot by 8 foot or 48 by 96 inch rectangle that identifies the area of the CNC. I'm going to lock that again. We will use this later. I have it hidden right now, but this layer represents what would be a 3/4 inch sheet of plywood that we would be cutting these parts out of. So this is our material layer, and if I turn that on, you'll see that I've just modeled a box and that is 4 foot by 8 foot by 3/4 of an inch thick, and that's going to represent our sheet of plywood. We'll use that later. I'll just hide it for now. And notice everything is laid out at 0, 0. So I mentioned that in the orientation training, but we're working at 0, 0 in Rhino, and that's going to be the left front corner of the CNC bed. The next thing I want to go through, just continuing through these layers, the basic idea here is if we have layers that are going to be associated with a specific machining operation, we want to organize those layers so that we can select all that geometry at once without having to go through and click individual things. If all of these geometries were on the same layer and each thing's going to be a different operation, then I have to go through and manually select each set each time. You could possibly achieve this through grouping, but that can confuse things and lead to certain issues and be less adaptable if you need to make changes to be constantly ungrouping and regrouping things. It can be a hassle. So I like to really practice good layer organization when I set up a CNC file, especially if it's a more complicated file with lots of different drilling and pocketing and profiling. We want to have individual layers for each of those things. So you can see here I have a layer for drill points and then 3/16. So that's 3/16 inch drill points that I'm going to be making. So I'm using a 3/16 inch drill bit to drill these points. Including that description in the layer can be handy, especially if you are doing a lot of different size drill holes in a single operation. So I could maybe have another layer where I'm drilling 1/4 inch holes. But if I right click, do select objects, you can see that gives me all my drill points. Some of the other layers here, so outside cuts, if I select those, that's going to be the outline of each of my part geometries. And then inside cuts, you can see is just this green layer here. So I'm going to cut on the inside of this, cut out these shapes. These will become holes in my part. Engraving is just the bottom here, and that's where we're going to engrave on that line and make like a little groove to outline the text. And then pocketing, we're going to carve out the area in between the text and just sort of make a little recessed area that shows those letters. And we're going to go through and I'll show you how to do each one of those in the next videos. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is order of operations. So when we're going to program the file, we want to think about what things need to happen first and second and third and so on. The last thing we want to do is cut out our overall parts. So we want to start with any operations that will happen internally to the part. So when you'll see as we go through the tutorial here, we will start with our drilling operations, and then we'll do any of the interior operations. The order doesn't matter too much at that point, but I'll do my inside cuts, my pockets, my engraving, anything that happens internal to these purple lines, the outside cut lines that we're going to cut outside. So the last thing we will do is our outside cuts. And that's the general logic that you should be using If you remember from the orientation video, we have a vacuum system that holds the larger sheet down, but as we cut out these smaller parts, they're at risk of moving. And so if we were to start with our outside cuts, then when we go to drill any of these points or carve these lines, the whole part could shift, and that would ruin the part, and we wouldn't have a useful part. So we want to start with the interior, and then at the very end cut out each of our final parts. I'm going to stop there for this video, and in the next one I'll pick up with drilling points. Thanks.